Okay, so here we have a kind of a partially assembled undercarriage. I haven't put the screws through yet that clamp the plastic of the struts onto the pipes. We've got the bottom plate here, and this has got to go between the undercarriage and the underside of the machine, and then we bolt through it with the screw here with the washer on it from the underside up into the mounts that we put on the underside of the frames. Okay, so put the undercarriage together now. We've got the little screws through here into the nylon nuts that basically pinch this together and cause it to grip the skid pipe. You can see the carbon bottom plate is in place. If I turn the machine upside down, you can basically see we've got 3 small screws which bolt into the bottom of the motor mount, and then the screws for holding the undercarriage on. And I was unfortunately missing a washer from the kit, so I had to put that screw in without a washer. But these just basically bolted straight through with some Loctite into the skid mounting bracket that we put onto the frames earlier. And that's pretty much it. That's the skids in place. Very simple affair. We can move on now, and the next thing in the manual is putting in the servos, but I'm actually going to skip past that for the moment. I'm going to do the servos last, and I'm going to move on to doing the tail system. So the next thing is putting together our tail gearbox and our tail pitch assembly and tail pitch slider. And just as I was finishing talking on that last session, I had this nagging feeling that I'd forgotten something, and in fact I have. It's the mount for the tail pitch bell crank that needs to go on the back of the frames. So if I just bring the frames in here, let's move those out of the way and just bring the frames in. It actually goes back here. There's 2 holes here, and this is the bell crank here, and it basically fits on there like that with the 2 screws and the washer to hold it in place. So I just bolt that onto the back there, and then we are in fact done, and we can move on to the tail system. Okay, and there we have the mount for the bell crank in place and bolted up and Loctited, and this is where the little arm will go at the back. It basically just sort of rotates here and takes the output from the servo at the front, the tail servo at the front, and puts it through a bell crank which mounts on here. I think it's above it actually, above it here, and it twists and sends the tail control down the boom. So that's now in place, so we can now start working on our tail system. Okay, so for this next section we're putting together part of the tail gearbox. The basics of this are that we have the tail bevel gear here, and we've got to put the tail shaft into it, so that goes through there like so, and that's the bevel gear in place for the tail gearbox. And then this other piece goes on the outside here like so, and that holds it all together and allows us to effectively then put the tail fin on there like so, and bolt that into place, and basically we then have 2 screws through there, 1 screw through there, and that all holds it together. But I'll do it a step at a time, and you can see how it goes as I go through it. Okay, so that's the item fully assembled. Literally it's just 3 screws, 2 through the horizontal fin and 1 directly into the outer gearbox case. Now that this is together, it's actually quite stiff. If I turn it around, you can hear that it's really quite a stiff mesh on there. I'm not going to do anything with that because it does turn, and I expect what will happen is a couple of flights it should bed in. But I'm going to have to keep a close eye on that because that is pretty stiff mesh. Okay, so the next thing is the tail rotor, and I've got the tail rotor here. With this, take the bolts out and get the thrust races out and grease them, and then put them back in and Loctite the bolts back in place. They aren't Loctited by default, as mine came in the kit, so you do need to take them out anyway. So while they're out, you may as well grease those thrust races and do your tail system a favour. Okay, the next thing we've got to do is we've got to fit this tail up with our tail pitch slider and our tail pitch mechanism. So that's the next few things I'm going to pull out to show you. Okay, so here we have the pieces of our tail pitch slider. It looks more complicated than it is. This arm here fits on the underside here like that and bolts into place with the 2 screws provided with it. These little ones over here, I think, yeah, these little tiny ones here. That's the first thing, and then you have to put a ball on the bottom there. Then when you've done that, this piece bolts onto the tail pitch slider like that. So you can see that. And basically that's what the other 2 screws are for, and they go through there and through there to hold it in place. It's fairly straightforward. I'll assemble it and you can see. Okay, so there we have stage 1 completed. It's bolted through at the bottom here, and then the ball in place. So that's the first bit. Now we need to install our pitch slider into this area here, so I'll do that next. Okay, so there we have the finished pitch slider. You can see, yeah, it's all working as it should. So the next thing is to bolt this to our tail rotor, which is through these arms here, and the screws that go through those go straight onto our tail rotor, onto the blade grip arms here. So that's the next thing for us to do. Okay, so here we have our tail rotor grips now connected to our pitch slider, as you can see. Just try and give you a decent view of that. Now, one of the things that you must make sure of is that when you fit the blade grips, you make sure that the blade grip arm here is leading the grip. So when you put your tail rotor blades in here, the blade will go in here and here, and the leading edge of the lower blade will be towards this side, and that's where you want this arm. So this is on the leading edge side of the blade, and again at the top here the leading edge would be towards this side, so you want the arm here towards the leading edge, and the tail rotor will rotate this way with the arm leading the blade. If you get it wrong, then you'll have problems with your tail rotor not quite working correctly on the machine, and you'll notice in the rest of the video actually that mine is back to front because I've had to refilm this particular piece because I wasn't quite paying attention and managed to put them on back to front for the rest of the video. So I've come back and refilmed this bit, taken this off and refilmed this just to show you the correct way to do this, and then just ignore how it is in the rest of the video because I wasn't really paying attention. Okay, so our first job is to just install this arm onto here. So this literally goes on there like that, and then we have a screw going in from either side to bolt it into place. So I'll just put those in. Okay, so there we have that installed, and that moves nice and freely. And the rest of our tail pitch mechanism actually connects onto here now. So I'll bolt that on so that you can see that. Okay, so now you can see that we've fitted the screws here and one on the other side to fit the bracket here onto our tail pitch slider. I've got the tail pitch slider on the tail output shaft, and I've also installed the grub screws either side on the tail rotor to grip those onto the tail output shaft. And now this piece comes round and fits onto there, and then when you look through here you can see that there is a hole and a thread, and we need to put a screw, one of these, with the little washer, the silver washers we've been using everywhere else on the machine, like that, to hold that in place there. So that will go in there like so. So I'll install that, and then we can start looking at building up our tail boom and torque tube. Okay, so next we're building up our torque tube, and this is the usual thing where you basically put the bearing inside the rubbers and then you install them onto your torque tube at a certain distance apart, and use some epoxy to stick them onto the torque tube at the set distances. And then we've got our ends. I've got one of them here to install. You put those in, and then we use these little button head bolts to hold them in place. And then when you've got them in, wrap a little piece of electrical tape around them as well, just to make sure that these don't come out. So Loctite them in and then put electrical tape around them as well, just to hold them in place. So I'm going to make up the torque tube now, and then we can insert that down through our boom and start looking at building up our front gearbox and attaching our tail gearbox onto the boom and mounting that all up into our frames that we've already built. Okay, so I've glued the bearings onto our torque tube. Now while we're waiting for those to set, we can actually get on with building our front gearbox, and this is it split into two halves. It was together and I've split it apart, and we basically need the gears, which I've got in one packet here, and the bearings for assembling it. And I'm just going to go through now and just show you how all this goes together. Okay, so the first thing is to put the bearings either end of our gear, front drive gear, and then just put that into place in the gearbox. Next thing to do is we get our other gear, and I've already inserted one of the bearings onto it. Then we have a bearing spacer, which I've just inserted on there, and then the other bearing goes on at the back, and that's our second gear. And if we bring back the gearbox, this one effectively sits down in there like that, and that's our gearbox assembled. And then we can put the two halves together, press it together, and start putting some bolts in it to bolt it up. Okay, so there you have it. I've just pushed it together now, and you can see it all works. Okay, so that's our front gearbox put together, and we should now be in a position where the bearings are glued onto the torque tube, so I can look at putting the ends onto the torque tube now and inserting that down through our boom. Okay, so here we have the completed torque tube. Basically we've got our end installed here. You can see the button headed screws either side, and I'm going to wrap this with a wrap of electrical tape in a moment. Then as we go down the boom, you get the first bearing installed, and then I'll need to turn this over to show you the other end. And then we've got our second bearing, and then our end installed. So that's the torque tube completed, apart from, as I say, just putting a wrap of electrical tape around there. Just belt and braces really, just to make sure those screws don't come out. So I know from experience with the Velocity 50, if you don't put a wrap of electrical tape around there, you can lose these screws and you can hear them rattling around in the boom. Okay, and there you can see one end where I have wrapped it in electrical tape effectively, just to make sure those bolts stay in place. Okay, so here we have the boom, and with the aid of some 3-in-1 oil on the rubbers and down the inside of the boom, I've managed to push my torque tube down inside the boom. That's now nicely installed down in there, and turns nice and freely as it should. So we're now in a position to start installing these different ends of the boom into the front gearbox and the tail gearbox. So that's the next thing for me to do. So I'm just showing you this end of the boom, which has got a cutout in it. If you look at the gearbox, the front gearbox, and you may not be able to see this in the light from the camera that I have here, but down inside there is a groove which this slot will locate into. So these two pieces go together. Okay, and there's our front gearbox now installed onto our boom. I've put the 4 screws in here and lock nuts the other side, and if I turn the torque tube at the other end, you can see it's turning the gears there, so it's all working as it should. So that's that end done. I've now got to put some push rod guides and that kind of stuff down the boom before we put the tail gearbox on. Okay, so you can see there's my 3 push rod guides just installed onto the boom, so that I'm now in a position to be able to install the tail gearbox on the back, and then we can start looking at putting the horizontal fin onto the boom and the boom supports, and then bolt the whole thing into the back of our frames. Okay, so there's the tail rotor inserted onto the boom. Now, to get the boom to go in here, a little tip to get that to go in is just to slacken off this bolt here. Slacken that off, it will give you a little bit of movement so that you can effectively get this to push in. But with that bolt done up, it's really hard to get the boom in, so just slacken it off, push the boom in, and you're good to go. And then effectively we've got to secure our boom into the gearbox with a bolt through here to bolt it up, and there may be some more stuff to do as well. Here I saw some other screw holes, so I'm just going to check those out. Okay, you can see up the back here that there are a couple of little screw holes, and if you line these up with holes in the boom, it makes the tail itself completely vertical on the boom. But in terms of actually clamping it, you don't use these screw holes. You just use this single M3 bolt through here to clamp the whole thing together. Loctite on it, and then do it up tight, and then that clamps your tail gearbox onto the boom. So that's the tail gearbox in place. So the next thing that I'm going to be looking at is the horizontal fin. Okay, so here we have our horizontal fin, and our fin clamp is the usual affair that it bolts round the boom, and then there are some little screws that go through the fin itself to bolt it onto the top, and then the big ones go in the side to bolt the boom supports onto the horizontal fin clamp. Okay, so there we have our horizontal fin, and I can just sort of twist this around here, and you can see it's clamped here, and we've got the holes here for our boom supports to go into. And that's the next thing really, is I'll bolt the boom supports onto here and then offer this up to the back of the frames. Okay, and there we have the boom supports installed, and I'm now at a point where this whole boom assembly is done really, and it can be bolted into the back of the frames. Okay, so it's getting quite difficult to get the whole helicopter under the camera now, but you can see the boom is now bolted into the back of the frames, and it's these 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and I've missed one. I've got one more screw to put in there, 6 bolts that hold it in place, and 6 bolts the other side. Also, I want to show you the tail boom support. mechanism here, I mean, this is solid as a rock. I mean, really unbelievably strong support for the tail boom supports. They're really going to do a good job of holding the tail together. So that's pretty much it. The tail's all bolted in, and we're starting to get down to you know, the cosmetics of the build now, and just sort of finishing off. I've still got servos to put in because I didn't do those earlier. We've still got to put the main gear in and mount the head that I built earlier as well, but really into the finishing off stages of the helicopter now. Okay, so next up we have the tail bell crank. It's just a case of putting the two balls into the outer holes on here and then screwing down through the top of this into the bell crank mount that we put on the back of the frames. Okay, and there we have our bell crank mounted on the back of the frames, and that's now complete. In the kit there's a set of tail blades which I haven't installed yet. I just got those here. I'm just going to put those onto the tail, and then we're into putting in the main gear and the main rotor head, and then last of all I'll be doing the radio installation and the servos. Okay, one other thing to make sure you don't miss is that the tail rotor has these bolts here that hold this in alignment. There's two above and two underneath. They're not very well shown in the manual that you have to fit these. They're sort of off to one side in the manual, so it's very easy to miss them. But basically there are 4 screws that go in here. Put those in and Loctite them up, and that's your tail secured, and then you can tighten up this bolt here as well to hold that whole assembly in place. And then once you've done that, you can fit your vertical tail fin and the additional bolt that goes in the side here, which holds everything all together.